Welcome everyone to the September webinar for the TELedvisors network. We're part of ADCET. We're a community of practitioners for people working in the third space in adult education. So learning designers, education technologists, academic developers, that whole family. And obviously we take a wide interest in a range of things to do with education, learning, technology, which is why our focus today is universal design for learning. We've got a number of experts in the room who will be sort of speaking to ways that universal design for learning principles are actually being put into practice in various institutions. Our second presenters today are from the University of New England, and it is Kate Mitchell and Steve Grono, and they're building on, I guess, a presentation they also did at ADCET recently about UDL in UpLift. Over to you.
Thanks, Colin. I'll note that the presentation that was given at ADCET was with Kashmira Dave. I'm sorry, forgive me, Kashmira, if I've butchered your surname. I'm going to need to. She can't be here today. She's actually part of the ADCET Research School, I think, which is great. There's another ADCET plug. But Steve has been working madly behind the scenes as part of UpLift to do some really amazing work around implementing some of our UpLift elements, which we'll speak to. So it's really a good chance to, I guess, expand on what was delivered around that context in the ADCET presentation while not duplicating it. So please feel free to go and check that out. I'll put some links in the chat while Steve's talking more about what his team have been working on. So Steve, could you maybe... Thanks. We'd like to acknowledge the Anayawan people, which UNE, is the country that UNE stands on. I'm also located remotely in Melbourne, which is Wurundjeri country of the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations. Everybody else is probably coming from various areas, so just acknowledging that we are on unceded land and we pay respect to elders past and present. In terms of UpLift, I won't cover too much on this because it was in our other presentation if you want the context around that. But just noting that really the whole UpLift project that's been going on at UNE, which I have been fortunate to kind of come in halfway through, so I don't necessarily feel qualified to talk about this, but I will. But Steve will also talk more. Is that UpLift is really, I guess, a big project to in part upgrade the LMS, which is Moodle, to a new version of Moodle, but use that as really a catalyst to look at also some curriculum improvement, some learning and teaching and quality of online learning improvement, upgrades around the whole ecosystem, and just considering how those bits fit together. So it's I guess, bringing in other improvements alongside that upgrade process and using that as an opportunity to do that work. So the UpLift elements, did we skip one or is it after this?
I think it's after this. Do you want me to jump forward and back again?
That's all right. No, it's okay. If it's after, I'll just speak to that. One of the UpLift elements is element 14, which specifically covers UDL, and I'll put a link to our UpLift elements in a minute. There are 16 in total, but you can see here that we actually do explicitly call out UDL as one of the UpLift elements. It is a little bit, I guess, broad, and at the moment, the way that we have kind of covered some of the essentials around that is really around encouraging people to put their content in as HTML and get it out of PDFs, encouraging them to put transcripts or captions on videos and get them into established university systems rather than maybe directly uploading them in ways that is, that then doesn't, I guess, they don't sit in those dedicated streaming platforms with captions and or transcripts. getting readings in place, some of those other things. So, but there are 16 elements, and while UDL is one of those elements, it is also really covered across all of the 16. There's a lot of duplication and overlap of these elements. So while it sounds quite daunting to have 16 elements that people have to try and meet, or encouraging them to meet and encouraging them to bring them into their practice, the reality is that there is quite a bit of overlap. And so particularly when we're talking about, say, visual identity, which Steve will talk to a bit more. A lot of that work is really about consistency, but that work is done for academics, for better or worse. There's also, in terms of, so I'm just going up my notes. And that element 1 is really to build consistency and remove distractions around cognitive load. So that taps into UDL. The welcome video includes transcripts and captions. So again, it's sort of doing double duty, but really trying to encourage welcoming and belonging. OERs is to ensure readings in reading list, and that where possible they're inclusive, which again is UDL. Quality media is talking about ensuring your audio quality in particular is clear, which, you know, supports accessibility. So there's, you know, element 8, 9, 12, 13, 15, all incorporate UDL in some form, or use it as a base, as well as, I guess, you know, overlapping a little bit in terms of, you know, there'll be similarities where if you've met one of these, you've probably met aspects of one or two others. So it's, I guess I'm just noting that it is really kind of meant to be holistic. In terms of implementing it, which is the big challenge, there are multiple teams working on it within our learning design team. There's been multiple agile sprints that have been where learning designers have been working with unit coordinators to do some work for them and do other work in consultation with them. It's quite a big task in a limited period of time. There's also been the Tiger team that Steve's going to talk to now that have been really building out some of that work to, you know, take some of the load off some of the other learning designers so that they could spend that time doing more of that consultation and work around unit content rather than, I guess, the basics that might be consistent across all units. As part of that, you can see some of the work that we're trying to do is really convert things to HTML where possible, get captions in onto videos, and then, you know, following up with some of those other points I mentioned. So I'm going to pass it over to Steve to talk more about Tiger Team and what that looks like in practice.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thanks for letting me come along and have a bit of a chat about the work we've been doing. Yeah, so I'll start off with just a bit of a context that sort of leads into this, and that is that as we work with these different frameworks, because they do draw on best practice, including these UDL principles, whether it's the UpLift standards, whether it's the TELS standards, whether it's ACODE or any other framework your institution may have, they tend to have these really nice overlaps between what's in them, regardless of which one you're following along with. But one of those overlaps that's not often talked about is that each one little line, when you shorten it down to that level, is a bit subjective and interpretable just by its very sort of nature. And there's this nice Brene Brown quote that I come back to a lot, and that's sort of paint done for me when you're having these type of discussions. If we don't have that consistent definition of what these little standards mean, what they'll look like, how they could be implemented, we're going to approach that different ways. We're going to interpret sort of what that means to each of us individually in different ways. And that's not all a bad thing when the goal is unit improvement, especially when you have an engaged academic you're dealing with. But if the other part of that project goal is to make each unit look like that nice mock-up image that we advertised, that we promised, of what a new platform might look like, well, then that's where this next bit comes in. That's the question of how do we reduce some of those what-if variables on some of those recurring items within the framework. So Tiger Team is a concept originally adapted from military usage in like the 60s, 70s by NASA. Not one purely based off my own particular hobbies, but relevant, interestingly enough. The Tiger Team is a problem-solving approach used by NASA originally in sort of that 70s context to investigate solutions of highly critical and complex issues, fitting that Project UpLift rocket theme from the link Kate put in the chat. It's one that's popularized during the Apollo 13 lunar landing incident, where after critical module failure, the select technical team was formed with that task of problem solving the issues and returning the crew home safely. But back on Earth, of these elements, of the data we've been gathering from the unit reviews and from the unit conversations, we begin to split out which of those are subjective and individualized level improvements, but which others in that framework that we're looking at are more systemic, which of them are templatable, which of them are more objective instead and could be targeted across all units. And so that's where we gather the team. UDL as a standalone element, like Kate talked about, is also one that's threaded throughout each of the parts. And Kate gave some nice examples of how they might apply. But going back to that lens of consistency, of templatable, of which can we split out in how we actually design and template our spaces, looking at that, back at that lens, of some of those, some begin to stand out a bit more. And that's visual consistency, sort of to ease that navigation fatigue. It's things like the little welcome video that is small, but it's that engagement, it's that sense of presence, it's that sense of belonging. Rubrics for student clarity of actionable and personalized feedback. Again, coming back to sort of those UDL themes. Progress indicators to help students track their individual progress and increase awareness of upcoming tasks. And that's the kind of things that we can begin to build into the learning design, not just through the individual conversations. So it becomes this opportunity to aim the ship a bit more intentionally. We're well positioned from within the learning design team here that Kate and I are working within to have begun those conversations. We've explored units and the different schools with some of their high quality elements that they've already got in place, and to gather those up into templated designs that will work well across those spaces, while also allowing continued iterative work with the academics for their individual conversations, while also fitting that new template, the new platform, the new Moodle upgrade, the new theme, to ease that burden of getting individual staff buy-in and understanding of core things, to allow our team to have that more rich conversation of the other side of things. The timely tweet here that Kate found resonated quite well on this point. When we make the technology itself more seamless and accessible, our learners get to focus more on the content and less energy expended on finding where their content has gotten to, so they can actually focus on the learning. So over my next couple of slides, I wanted to get a bit more practical in the examples. So what we came up with, what we drew from this, in addition to the sort of richer conversations with individuals, is this unit home, this general look and feel of the front section. Here, we've utilized the tile type layout at UNE for some time, but what goes into each has varied between schools and units alike for a long time. And ongoing temptation for large messages, or if an academic isn't sure where to put things, to drop more and more in that top section. If you don't know, we'll just throw it up here. And over time, as the teaching goes on, it becomes their learning, the bits they want to engage with and should be engaged with, ends up further and further down the page rather than where the students are. So revisiting that from an accessibility point, from a UX perspective, this means we can begin to flip that around by intentionally designing some key points of navigation, going back to that visual identity type space. So you'll see here the first two tiles stand out a little bit because they're the ones that we have some structures in place into, in terms of what goes into them as a framework. And then again, it goes into sort of the academic content side of it. Beyond that, up the top, just a clear, punchy sort of welcome message, welcome materials, where there is that sort of sense of teacher presence I talked about. That clutter I mentioned from before gets tidied back into the toy box. So here it is in the unit information tile, that first consistent tile. But it's easy to find on each and every visit. You can see in that previous picture, you get straight down to the content. And as the weeks progresses, the modules progresses, the topics progress, you can go directly into the piece that's most relevant to you within this space. So here we have clear labels dividing information, resources, and forums a bit further down beyond the screenshot under each. in terms of the outline you see here, that contains standardized approved content from our handbook, from sort of our source of truth. For example, assessments and outcomes. They're unit specific, but they're also locked in. They're the kind of things that have been accredited. They can't be changed. They're what we sort of agreed to. The information site link here, again, takes that idea of best practice that existed in some areas and built that into other schools that didn't have that opportunity before. So school-specific items, but aren't necessarily unit-specific. So for policy changes, if a link changes, we can put it in one key, easy-to-find place, rather than having to track back through 200 different units every time one little policy link changes. So it's useful not just to the student experience of finding broken links, getting the information that's relevant that they need, but also to our team sanity as well, which is definitely a win-win. And then that, of course, leaves the more subjective unit-specific, how do I teach this unit, how do I get around this unit type things, how to study within the unit moreover. In that unit information heading under the resources heading as things build up. They're still building up, but they're built up in clear, predictable spaces. And the final piece from me is that second tile, the assessment tile. And that is a dedicated sort of space for those assessment tasks. And a version of that has existed in some form over time, but the clarity of what was within that can often vary at times between units, between schools, between individual interpretations, again, going back to that Brené quote. Are all the tasks listed here under clear headings in the section, or at times somewhere here in less ordered collective, or at other times scattered throughout the content itself? And I imagine that's similar thinking about your own structures and institutions where you're working within. But the follow-up on that is when they're not clear titled and they aren't in a predictable space and they're descriptions of what the task is, it gets easier and easier to lose track rather than gain clarity of where the assessment tasks are, where the weight is, where the importance for the student value to focus their energy and time onto, their sort of cognitive load onto. So taking that idea of best practice from units where there is really clear and explicit design, what you end up is, well, you get clear headings, you get their weights listed, you can see here automatic due dates listed both inside the task but also outside the task, which is a new feature as part of the Moodle upgrade to 4.1, and relevant material bundled with those particular tasks, including chances for both query forums and for more private feedback points. I might take a breath and hand back to you for the challenges and takeaway, Kate.
Yeah, sure. And I'll try and keep it quick so we've got time for questions. I guess that the main thing has been that a lot of this is kind of iterative, which is great in some ways, but it also means that you're kind of designing the plane while building it, while flying it. And it means that some of the work that kind of gets done sort of needs to be redone a little bit because it's, it's sort of figuring out what works as we're doing the thing. So that can be a challenge, just in terms of, sustainability and coming to agreement and, potentially sort of duplicating that work. I think the other piece is really around like when you're working with tight timeframes in anything, trying to get buy-in and do that communication piece across an institution when we often work in silos is really hard, and that really then has a potential impact around how people feel about coming on that journey. There is also a piece where some of it we're trying to do for people where that can work both ways, in that some people, it takes off that workload for people, but if they don't understand why it's being done and they don't feel like they've been consulted or had input into it, they can they may just, it potentially affects their sense around their agency and autonomy. So especially when we're dealing with, you kind of potentially changing what somebody feels about, what their unit is. So I think that that's a real kind of balance where, it could just be hard, and trying to consult with people and do things with them rather than at them. Do you know what I mean? It's sometimes a real challenge to get that balance right. There's also, I guess, that piece around UDL and understand, communicating that back so that even if we are supporting and maybe doing some of that work for people, that they understand why that's been done and understand the rationale and aren't then necessarily changing things back, because otherwise you get into that cycle of maybe that work doesn't stick long term. So that's a real, I guess, concern around also that thing of like projects versus sustainable practice, and what do you do in a project versus what then gets carried across into ongoing business as usual. Often, especially when then projects are the things that get funded, but really, business as usual sometimes is the less sexy bit that isn't always resourced in the same way. I think, we're lucky in that we have a pretty good sized team and really good leadership that helps with some of that. But just projects in general often have a lot of these similar challenges. Steve, do you want to add some things?
Oh, I don't think I have anything to add, but just to confirm, it's very much about that iterative design sort of side of the challenge. It's getting over your own stress of getting everything right the first time for the team, because there are so many moving pieces, the upgrade, and also theming it, and also interpreting this project, and also having to manage those many different pieces of the puzzle. But then bringing that back to give it a try, see how much progress we've made, particularly how far we've come based on sort of previous versions that we've come from. And then, refine, and see what is really working when we put it into practice, and where we can go from there. That's sort of the positive spin on the flying the plane while building it part, but it definitely feels like both, depending on the day or depending on the hour of the day at times.
Yeah, the one thing I will add is that it's like, it is the good thing is that it also has been very much communicated out that it is iterative, and where it's aspirational, and that there isn't, it's not meant to be punitive. It's not meant to be that everybody is expected to do everything now, but that we are really trying to continue that as ongoing practice and keep refining and improving over time. So hopefully that gets out as the message, which I think is a really important one, which reiterates what Amy was mentioning about the +1 and what Tom Tobin was saying. It's also allowed us to have some good conversations with the accessibility team, the Student Accessibility and Wellbeing Office, and to look at how do we build more ways to make that simple for people. So we don't have Blackboard Ally, but we're looking at a Moodle integration called Brickfield, or we're looking at, like, I guess, other technologies that might be possible to implement in. What kinds of other things can we build into business processes to make it so that the work is easier to get right, when it's being built from the start. So so hopefully those sorts of things continue. I think that's been a really positive part.
And similarly, once we have that groundwork, how can we continue to build on that and sort of see where it goes once the essentials are really taken care of? Is a fun thing to look forward to, I think. A challenge for the moment, that's for sure.
I think there might be a couple of questions. There's one which someone shared directly with me, but I might just get you to talk to it, Steve. It's something about restricting access to assessment.
To the academic integrity. I think I saw that one go by. So that was a Moodle plugin we had developed. So our academic integrity module sits outside of the individual unit, but when they do get it, they're awarded with that micro-credential badge. And we can then use the permissions in Moodle to say, if you don't have this badge, you can't access this particular activity. And then to sort of tie that into sort of that system level. Again, similar part of that clarity, but also pathing them through the information.
There's also some of that consistency in the progress indicators. And I think, like, so some of that I really love, and where we can kind of like turn those things on. And I think all of these things, I guess the other point I wanted to make, because I can't see many other questions, was just if you're in at the TELedvisors team, I've been pushing that, like, the new Universities Accord is coming up. That's going to really push student support and ensuring that students are really supported in retention and completion in a different way, and so that potentially changes the game around us, universities showing what they're doing to support students from an academic skills level and in other ways. So I think all of these things really help to support students, and the things that we can also show that we're doing to support students. So it's a good chance to be thinking about what the accord means in practice, as well as like some other changes that are potentially happening, at least in Victoria, around accessibility. So there's more of an impetus to be doing this work.
Right. Did anyone else have any other questions? Feel free to pop something in the chat or unmute yourself. I think we've covered a lot. Looks like, I mean, as someone who is also right in the middle of a massive Moodle upgrade change, it's fascinating to see the work that's going on your side of the world.
Thank you.
If we don't have any questions, I know there's a bunch of chat messages. No, lots of thank yous. There's a Tell Us Full Day workshop coming up in Brisbane. There was wide-ranging discussion in the chat, which is always good. All right. Well, I might just take the opportunity to thank all of our presenters, Amy Schoberg, Anita Jones, Kate Mitchell, and Steve Grono. I think this has been a fantastic session. Recordings should be up on our YouTube channel in the next few days, and we will promote that through the regular channels. And thank you so much for your time.